Oh, my task in this morning's offering is to paint a broad picture of the general context about these issues of science inquiry, students' learning and assessment. How, within that general context, does this particular exercise of the SAILS project fit? So I'm standing back from the detail of the project because that will be something that Chris will talk about after me. So one of the things we have to be clear about, although I won't have much to add to what Brian's already given us, is to think through the aims of inquiry-based learning in science in terms of three options. Aim A, for the learner to understand and be able to use some of the methods that scientists use. Or is it aim B, so that learners know about the main concepts of science and about how scientists discovered these? Or is it aim C, to help the learner to become effective, independent, yet collaborative and responsible in present and future learning tasks? Which of these do you prefer? Are they in conflict? And what's assessment got to do with it? Isn't it strange to think about inquiry, helping us to do inquiry, and it's got assessment in its title? Is that right? Well, I would say, first of all, that aim C is my hero. That's the most important longer-term thing. Aim B is the bottom of the pack for me. You need it, but it's not an aim in its own right. And aim A is somewhere in between. But whatever, we have to think in those terms. And let's look at aim C. Effective, independent, collaborative, responsible in present and future learning tasks. That's a very big call. Let me illustrate that by a quotation from a piece by David Hargreaves, an article called The Knowledge Creating School. Schools must prepare students to increasingly higher levels of knowledge and skill, not just in the conventional curriculum or even in ICT, important as these are, but also in the personal qualities that matter in the transformed workplace. How to be autonomous, self-organizing, networking, entrepreneurial, innovative, with the capability constantly to redefine the necessary skills for a given task and to access the sources for learning these skills. That needs some thought. What are we doing in inquiry-based learning which goes after autonomy, self-organizing, networking, entrepreneurial, innovative, constantly to redefine the necessary skills? In the world outside, tasks don't come neatly in packages. They come as a messy reality, and you ask any employer what they value, people who can tackle things by drawing on, creating, interconnecting different skills, different ideas, and take responsibility for pushing things forward. Okay, that's very broad, heady background. What about the realities of assessment and how they relate to classroom activities? Well, in the more general way of talking about formative assessment, we tend to, put these in the context of different forms of feedback. This is a standard list here, many like it: feedback in discussion, feedback in written work, self and peer assessment, formative use of tests, peer group learning. That's fine. Where does assessment come in? Well, let me stand back a bit for the moment. Assessment is simply collecting evidence of how things are going. What matters then is how you use that evidence. If you use it to guide the learning, to change the learning plan, to readapt to where pupils happen to be, then of course you're using it formatively. If you use it to sum up, to make a decision, to give long-term guidance, you're using it summatively, and you can of course use it for both. In fact, I'd like to say there's no such thing as formative assessment. as assessment for formative purposes. But let's think through those anyway in terms of learning. In discussion, the feedback aims to pick up what people say, work with it, and get them to say more, to explain themselves, to exchange with one another's. What lies behind that that's of value? Well, here's what Robin Alexander says about it. Children we now know need to talk and to experience a rich diet of spoken language in order to think and to learn. Reading, writing, and number may be acknowledged curriculum basics, but talk is arguably the true foundation of learning. That's a strong statement. And one of the things I would say is, do you really believe that? Do you believe there's value in people talking with one another and exchanging in a to and fro conversation with the teachers? Is that learning? Because one of the things that Robin Alexander found out from a very big survey of schools in many different countries, that in some cultures people don't believe that at all. Talk is just sort of the icing on the cake. The real learning is when you write it down. In other cultures, notably found in the Soviet Union, there's the reverse belief that talk really matters. And you can think more briefly about what's going on and look more deeply, in fact, at what's going on when people are talking. Such encounters are the source of experiences which eventually create the inner dialogues that form the process of mental self-regulation. Viewed in this way, learning is taking place on at least two levels. The child is learning about the task, developing local expertise, and he or she is also learning about how to structure his or her own learning and reasoning. That struck me as a weird statement to start with, but when you think about it, it actually relates to, I found it relate to what's happening when I'm engaged in a discussion. There's the surface thing of what we're talking about, and how this argument is a better way of doing it than that way, and how his idea was different from mine, all those things. But underneath that, you're thinking, hey, why didn't I think of that? Why is that thing I had, which appeared to me brilliant in the way to do it, not so good as I thought it was going to be, because I've heard a different one? That's the mental self-regulation, the lower level, or the deeper level, rather. That idea of two levels come from the Russian psychologist Vygotsky is extremely important one. So there's more happening than appears to be the case if pupils are engaged, really engaged in a learning dialogue. And then one can also begin to think of another sort of feedback, because that seems to be only about oral in dialogue and discussion. There's also feedback in learning and interaction in writing. The timescale is different, and if insofar as the teacher's doing assessment of pupils' individual writing, it can be more one-on-one. But it's not completely different. It's a form of dialogue if we make it a dialogue. Those given feedback as marks are likely to see it as a way to compare themselves with others, ego involvement. Those given only comments see it as in fact helping them to improve, task involvement. The latter group outperform the former. Feedback given as rewards or grades enhances ego rather than task involvement. That is, the way we give feedback, and this is now referring to written work, can have variable effects, good or bad. That's been developed much more by American psychologist Carol Dweck. With ego involvement, both high and low attainers are reluctant to take risks and react badly to new challenges, and failures simply damage self-esteem. That is based on a lot of research studies he has done. People who think, I'm really bright, I'm top of the class, I always do very well, think they're intrinsically bright. When they go into a different school or to higher education, they're nervous. Because if they can't see their way to do this new task, they try to avoid it. Because if you don't do it, you can always say, I could have done it. If you do it and fail, hey, I thought I was really bright, and now I'm not. Not bad. With task involvement, learners believe that they can improve by their own effort, are willing to take on new challenges, and to learn from failure. And one of her pieces of advice to teachers and to parents in her main great book on this topic, on self-theories, she says, never praise a child. Huh? Never praise a child? No. Praise what they did. You don't think the value is intrinsic to them, something they can't change. You say you did a good job. Next time they could do a bad job, and that would be a consistent remark. Whereas if they think they're intrinsically bright, and then you tell them they're not, they get confused and worried. So we must be very careful about the way we give feedback. And what's particularly important then is that written work, which is quite often taken and then looked at, marked or commented on and given back to pupils, becomes part of a learning process, not something that's over and done with. Pupils tend to look at feedback that they get on written work, and if it's given in terms of marks, they look at what they got, look at what their friend got, and then that's the end of it, on to the next topic. That's a wasted opportunity. There's no dialogue there. With comments, one can expect pupils to do something with the comments to improve on it. Then you're using more smartly all that effort. Students are not good at knowing how much they are learning, often because we as teachers do not tell them in an appropriate way. When asked by a visitor how well she was doing in science, the student clearly stated that the comments on her exercise book and those given verbally provide her with the information she needs. Now that is reflective writing by a teacher who'd worked with Chris and myself and others at King's in developing assessment practices, and she had found it quite a shock to hear us say, don't give marks on grades, give them just comments, expect them to work on it. But this is what came of it. Change the student's attitude to this mode of learning, and it's a mode of learning, not a mode of judgment. And to develop that further and be more ambitious, and you will be aware I'm skating over a large number of things very quickly in this talk, peer marking adds an extra dimension. Instead of the teacher doing the marking, you get pupils to look at one another's. We regularly do peer marking. I find this very helpful indeed. A lot of misconceptions come to the fore, and we then discuss these as we are going over the homework. I then go over the peer marking and talk to pupils individually as I go around the room. And we know that teachers' work has been observed by researchers, that the sort of thing that would happen is that pupils are told to exchange, look at one another's efforts on a piece of homework in small groups, and then discuss with one another, why is that good, which of these is best, what's good about that, what did I miss there, what's gone wrong with this one. And the teacher listens into those discussions and then can recognize that certain issues that have really not worked and need more work on it, others where we can just say, well, okay, revise, rewrite that thing, because those pieces of writing shouldn't be seen as final, they should be seen as steps on a road. And even there's value in rewriting important things once you've been through these discussions and recognized from discussion with other people what's involved. Because one of the difficulties that people have is knowing what would count as a good answer. It's commonplace to say you must have a clear target, measure the difference between where you are on the target, and then close that gap. That implies that you understand the target. But quite often when you really clear understand what you're aiming at, you're halfway to learning it anyway. But by putting that in, I'm also opened up another one. If you put pupils in groups, do they work creatively? Does it work well? General finding from pieces of research by several groups, particularly a group between King's and the Institute of Education, and a group at the OU by Neil Mercer. When they studied pupils' group work in classrooms, which is very common, they found that group work, the quality of the discussion in that group work was poor. Pupils went off task, the pupils saw it as a way to compete, to prove who's right, rather than engaging in a learning discussion and so on. And one of the interesting things that Neil Mercer did was to work, in this particular case with science classes in Year 5, to train them to work more effectively in groups. And part of the training was, for example, someone in the group would be responsible for standing up to report their conclusions at the end. And that person will be advised, if they're wandering off it, you've got to bring them back, because you've got to stand up and say what they agreed at the end. But another of the very important features, someone had to make sure that nobody made an assertion without giving a reason. And it's okay to contradict others, but nobody must make a contradiction without giving a reason for their contradiction. And as a result of that, he observed groups before the training and after the training and listened to their discussion. And here's one of his results. Pre-intervention, those groups used words like because, I think, would, could, not very often. After the training, the same groups later produced those same terms 3 times more frequently. These have become learning discussions. Those words had turned up. One of the key things to look for in classroom dialogue is to say how often the pupils are using the words I think and because and should. I've found certainly looking at classroom transcripts, where that distinguishes creative discussions from ones which are rather one way. Now, to add to that, also want to look at the other end of the assessment spectrum, from the formative to the summative, because I see that as a spectrum, and make the point that pupils looking at written work are reflecting on what they've done. A written piece of homework, for example, is a review, an oversight, a putting together of what's been done in the to and fro of a classroom. A test is very similar, or could be very similar in its function. One of the slogans I learned many years ago from reading an article by a Scotsman written in about 1988, and his slogan was, a test at the end is too late. It's too late precisely because it is at the end. You're not going to learn from it anymore, you're just going to learn that you're good or bad. Whereas, given the effort put into setting the test and pupils doing it and then assessing it, the result, why not use all of that as a learning opportunity? After each end-of-term test, the classes grouped more to learn from each other. The researcher has interviewed them on this experience, and they're very positive about the effects. Some of their comments show that they are starting to value the learning process more highly, and they appreciate the fact that misunderstandings are given time to be resolved, either in groups or by me. They feel that the pressure to succeed in tests is being replaced by the need to understand the work that has been covered, and the test is just an assessment along the way of what needs more work and what seems to be fine. So that's a conversion of the informal testing into a positive part of a learning process, and for pupils to come to see it that way. This is not something to be frightened of, to judge you at the end. It's another way of engaging in the learning dialogue at different levels to help you to do better. And that, again, in the same project that we explored in King's to develop assessment practices, that's what came out. This is a writing again by a teacher reflecting at the end of that work on one of the main things that she had learned. Now, I want to put that together because I'm stressing all the time contributions to these sort of activities, and the use of feedback at different levels, formative to summative, in helping learning. And in order to go at that, would take the question, what can capable learners do? What would count in general terms of good contribution to education? One is they can engage in learning from interactive dialogue. They can reflect critically on the detailed outcomes of their own work and to take initiatives to improve it. Reflect critically. Be accustomed to the fact that when someone else looks at it, discuss it with people, you weren't as brilliant or as straightforward as you thought you were, and you can do better. Collaborating group work, I've just been emphasizing that. You go to any discussion produced by industrialists and business people about what they value in new employers, one of the things they always say, collaborating group work. Achieve a broad overview of their progress and guide their development in the light of the aims. That's that lower level, that reflection, that thinking of where am I going, getting what's called metacognition, an overview, understanding what the aims mean through studying concrete examples perhaps. It's that broader overview which picks someone out as a capable learner. Make their own decisions in well-informed and thoughtful ways. Well, you only learn that through the practice of making decisions and dealing with the consequences of them, some of which can be good, some of which can be bad or disastrous, and you have to start again and think more carefully. Integrate the many elements of performance in ways that will be needed to meet real and complex tasks that society will increasingly encounter. I mean, I'm reflecting that quote used from Hargreaves at the beginning, but this is reality of life out there or in scientific research. That is something you've got to be able to do because it doesn't come in packages. Problems come all messy. But what I want to emphasize here is that this is a list that would apply to all school subjects. Let's think of applying it to science. What particular contribution to a list of that sort can science education make? And I would say that under those, particularly on the last one, F, inquiry-based learning is uniquely placed to make a very strong contribution to the general learning of pupils. It's not just this is better science and give you a better science grade, it is actually a specific contribution of this subject area to the general learning development, the general capability in work, in life in the future that science education can make. So we should boast about science education being very good at doing this, but we can only boast if we're engaged in inquiry-based learning of the type that, with the general qualities that Brian was putting out so clearly before, and which will be developed in Chris's talk later. But then also, let's think about testing and assessment, because what's the final summative assessment? What are the tests for inquiry-based learning? How we create an endpoint which can also be a point for reflection and for advice. And I say advice because one of the issues is, what do test results tell us? Be they the results at the end of a term, the results in the school at the end of the year, or the results at the end of schooling phases. What do those tell us? Well, I'm afraid to say that my description of what present formal tests tell us, the sort that are set in many GCSE exams, are the following. The ability to produce from memory without access to any resources, within a few hours in the exam room, written accounts of a few topics, selected from a few years of study, in a high-stress situation when one's future opportunities depend on the outcome. That's testing, that's the real stuff, that's how we learn where you are in the league tables. I think it's pretty dreadful. There's nothing wrong with it, but that be the sole way is weird. I cannot imagine, for example, a school where the school mentors and assesses the progress of individual teachers by sitting them in a room at the end of a year teaching and asking them to write formal test answers. Why do such a crazy thing when you've known the teacher all the year, you learn an awful lot about it, you don't have to lean on the small sample you can tell in this very peculiar context. So one of the issues is, what's the summative assessment for inquiry-based learning? What form should it take? And one of the reasons why we should get this right is because of the importance of validity. Here's one way to look. The pupils might be looking at it as a result of this test feature. There's a cartoon from the US background. I hope there's a lot of job openings that involve filling in bubbles with number 2 pencils. Yes, out of the mouths of babes, we are condemned. Bubbles, of course, are the way you tick in a multiple choice test. It's crazy, and pupils, if they think about it, might see that it is, but of course they don't, because they're constrained by it. And validity is important. What does it mean? Validity is achieved when inferences that users of the results need to make are justified by the evidence. And the users of the evidence, the people who use the data, the results from summative assessments, are the pupils themselves, those who teach that pupil next year, all those involved with the pupil after schooling is completed. And commonly enough, of course, if you're teaching pupils in a new group at the beginning of a school year, you may want to know, you certainly will want to know, how they achieved at the end of the previous school year. Will that evidence, as produced by the school assessment system, tell you what you need to know? And some of the work Chris and I others have done more recently before this project started on school summative assessment skills found that hadn't been thought through very much. Schools were just doing the test at the end because the test is the nasty bit you have to do. It gets in the way of the learning. This is a completely wrong perspective. The assessment should be built in throughout and should reflect and help the learner's learning progress. And that's all very well and important for continuity between one year group and another in the school, but it's also very important for the pupil. If you give the pupil a grade, a mark, an assessment which says you are good at this subject, are you really giving them sound information, or you're misleading them? And my own experience, the first part of my career, I was 20 years doing physics research and teaching physics undergraduates, was that some were quite shocked when they entered the course and were put in a lab where there's nothing on the bench, just cupboards full of equipment, and told to tackle a problem, completely thrown. They'd never done that before. And I thought, well, that's 30 years ago, I've forgotten. But more recently, a piece of research inquiry done by the group at the Institute of Education and in York. Part of that work, they were asking first-year university teachers what they discovered about their new undergraduates and their skills and practices. And as one chemistry teacher put it, well, in the laboratory in the first term, above the sound of the weeping, that's often drowned above it by the sound of the breaking glass. What he was saying was, when these students come into a laboratory and they're given a task to explore, the first thing they want to know is, what equipment do I use? The answer is, up to you. But which part do we look at? It's up to you. How do we measure? It's up to you. The cupboards there are full of equipment. You go and choose whichever you want. They weren't used to that either, hence the breaking glass. Isn't that dreadful? I mean, it's amusing. And the university Tutors then have a big job to put that right. But those pupils have been misled. They thought they were good at this and would enjoy doing it, and what this was, what being good at this meant, and what enjoying doing it, what doing it meant, they had not realized. They'd been given the wrong picture. They've been told they're good at something which is not authentic. So validity is extremely important for the pupil, and if we do not give them appropriate advice, then we are misleading them, doing them harm. So let me go back to draw this to a close. I put this up at the beginning, aims of inquiry-based learning in science. For the learner to understand and be able to use some of the methods that scientists use, inquiry can do some of that, so that learners know that the main concepts, about the main concepts of science and about how scientists discovered these, yes, but also about how to use them, how to select from them, what they actually mean in practice when you're tackling something on the bench which isn't doing what you thought it should do. And finally, to help the learner to become effective, independent, yet collaborative and responsible in present and future learning tasks. I hope it's clear that all those are involved, but the third is the greatest, that the third, the complex task involving all those, in fact requires knowing, understanding the concepts sufficiently well, or being capable of exploring them in order to see how they help with the problem you're tackling, and certainly inquiry deals with understanding, able to use some of the methods that scientists use. So the big claims here for inquiry-based learning. And behind those big claims are my list of what capable learners can do. I simply repeat that here because I think it can't be repeated often enough. And our difficulty is through all the steps in the spectrum, from formative of on-the-fly dialogue in a classroom to formative interaction through the slower and more reasoned discussion or assessment of written work to overview, from the further towards the summative end of the spectrum through tests, informal or formal tests, end of a term, end of a topic, end of the year, again involving pupils in the marking to make those tests at learning opportunity, and finally in the summative test that is at the end, the validity that it actually gives people information on which they can rely and on which others can rely. One of the main breakthroughs we had in working with teachers on developing their summative assessment skills was to ask them to consider, what does it mean to be good at science? And we're doing that in maths and English too. What does it mean to you as an English teacher to be good at English? And teachers love their subject and can talk about that very creatively. And when they come to some conclusion about the answer to that question, then the issue is, how does your summative assessment reflect that? How does your summative assessment actually show that somebody is good at something in the authentic terms that you have laid out? And what we have to do with inquiry-based learning is to build in all those different stages and levels of assessment, including the last one, the summative. I think the summative doesn't require a written paper and pencil test of inquiry. It does require, for example, that pupils give a presentation of the results of their work to the rest of their class, that pupils have to write some sort of formal report individually, perhaps collectively, perhaps on the outcome of what they learned from this project, but that is not set in stone as finished, but is used as an argument to develop, improve, and do it again, or rewrite it so as to make it a better quality. There are some in a form, in an area of work called dynamic assessment, where they say they believe that you set people a test or a session and get the results, and then they discuss the results in detail and how to improve them, and then you get them to do the same test again. Isn't that silly, doing it again? What they claim is that when you do that, the rank order of people in the second time is very different from the rank order the first time. That is, those who can do fairly well off the cuff or with formal beginning only, when they've been able to reflect and think, come out quite differently, develop more. We have to think about that too. And just to close, there's a teacher we had worked with reflecting on the work as a whole. There was a definite transition at some point, focusing on what I was putting into the process and what the pupils were contributing. It became obvious that one way to make a significant, substantial change, sustainable change, was to get the pupils to do more of the thinking. I then began to search for the ways to make the learning process more transparent to the pupils. Indeed, I now spend my time looking for ways to get pupils to take responsibility for their learning, at the same time making the learning more collaborative. And the question is, can we say, aim at the position where each teacher, in their own way, because there won't be a single way of doing this, can be able to say at the end, this is a good description of how we developed inquiry-based skills, and it certainly will involve developing the assessment of inquiry integral with the practices of it. And that's not easy. The big challenge, the end of a project of this, is how do you get it out there? There is no quick fix that can be added to existing practice with promise of rapid reward. On the contrary, if the substantial rewards of which the evidence holds out promise are to be secured, this will only come about if each teacher finds his or her ways of incorporating the lessons and ideas that are set out above into his or her own patterns of classroom work. This can only happen relatively slowly and through sustained programs of professional development support. And that's Dylan William and myself commenting on research results which we'd reviewed in 1998, and everything I've been involved in since has told me how true that is. So the big next post-SAILS challenge is how do we get it out there, and get it out there without pretending this is a recipe which you can apply and do well by following its rules. It won't work like that. Teaching's too individual, it's too depends too much on the personality and style of the teacher and on the context of the school and the pupils. How can we support the sustained programs of professional development which are needed to get full value from what's been achieved in this project?